Medieval justice, the horrifying truth behind boiling oil, torture and execution. Welcome back to Dark Medieval, where we journey into the most harrowing chapters of our ancestral past. Today, we confront a punishment so severe that its very mention struck terror into medieval hearts. We invite you to support our channel as we explore medieval justice, the horrifying truth behind boiling oil, torture and execution. Stay with us until the end as we unveil this dark historical truth. First, the origins of boiling oil punishment. The practice of execution by boiling oil emerged during the turbulent centuries of early medieval Europe. Stone castles rose from muddy earth, while methods of punishment grew increasingly elaborate and cruel. In the great halls where nobles feasted on roasted meats and honeyed wine, discussions of justice often turned savage. The concept of public punishment served not merely to penalize the guilty, but to terrorize potential transgressors. Ancient Roman traditions of spectacular executions influenced medieval authorities seeking control over restless populations. Boiling oil represented an evolution of older practices involving hot liquids and molten metals. The first documented cases appeared in chronicles written by monastery scribes on parchment illuminated by candlelight. These leather-bound records described executions carried out in castle courtyards before assembled crowds. Medieval physicians understood that boiling oil caused unimaginable suffering before merciful death finally arrived. The extreme heat destroyed flesh and bone, while victims remained conscious during initial moments of agony. Religious authorities debated whether such extreme punishments aligned with Christian teachings about mercy and redemption. Yet many clergymen argued that earthly suffering might purify souls destined for divine judgment. The symbolism of boiling oil held particular significance in medieval cosmology and theological thinking. Fire represented both purification and damnation depending on context and the nature of transgression. Kings and regional lords adopted this method when they deemed ordinary beheading or hanging insufficient deterrence. The spectacle served their political purposes by demonstrating absolute authority over life and death. Trade routes connecting European kingdoms spread knowledge of various execution techniques across borders and cultures. Merchants traveling dusty roads carried tales of foreign punishments witnessed in distant marketplaces. Castle executioners became specialized craftsmen who maintained the equipment and knowledge necessary for various punishments. They lived in separate quarters near execution grounds, marked by their profession's dark reputation. The method's adoption reflected broader medieval beliefs about the body as a site of correction. Physical suffering was understood as a pathway to spiritual transformation or ultimate justice. Second, the apparatus of agony. The execution apparatus centered on massive iron cauldrons forged in workshops where blacksmiths hammered metal heated red. These vessels measured several feet across and could contain enough oil to submerge a human body. Castle blacksmiths worked for weeks creating cauldrons strong enough to withstand extreme heat without cracking. The iron walls had to be thick and the rivets perfectly sealed to prevent dangerous leaks. Beneath the cauldron, workers constructed elaborate fireboxes using stone and clay bricks arranged in precise patterns. These structures directed heat efficiently upward while protecting executioners from flames during the procedure. Massive iron chains suspended the cauldron from wooden beams, reinforced with iron brackets and supports. Pulleys and mechanical devices allowed executioners to raise or lower the vessel as circumstances required. The oil itself came from various sources depending on regional availability and economic considerations. Olive oil proved expensive, so authorities often substituted rendered animal fats or cheaper vegetable oils. Heating the oil to boiling temperature required hours of preparation and constant attention from assistants. They fed wood continuously into the flames while monitoring the liquid's temperature and movement. Stone steps led up to platforms where condemned prisoners stood during final moments before execution. Guards positioned themselves at intervals to prevent escape attempts or interference from sympathetic crowds. Iron implements, including hooks, poles, and restraining devices, lay ready for use during the procedure. These tools allowed executioners to manipulate bodies without approaching dangerously close to boiling liquid. The execution site typically occupied a prominent location within castle walls or town squares where crowds gathered. Wooden barriers kept spectators at safe distances while ensuring clear views of proceedings. Drainage channels carved into cobblestones directed fluids away from the execution area after completion. These practical considerations reflected the authorities' experience conducting public punishments regularly. The entire apparatus represented significant investment in materials, labor, and maintenance by governing authorities. This commitment demonstrated the importance placed on public displays of severe justice. Third, crimes worthy of the cauldron. Counterfeiting coins represented one crime frequently punished by boiling in medieval judicial systems across Europe. Monarchs viewed tampering with currency as direct attacks on royal authority and economic stability. Forgers worked in hidden workshops where they melted silver and gold to create false coins. Their crimes threatened the financial foundations of kingdoms built on precious metal currencies. Treason against crowned heads or powerful nobles often resulted in sentences involving boiling oil or liquids. Plotting against rulers endangered not just individuals but entire social orders built on hierarchical loyalty. Heresy charges brought by ecclesiastical courts sometimes resulted in secular authorities administering extreme physical punishments. Those who challenged religious orthodoxy faced terrible consequences for threatening spiritual and temporal order. Certain murders, considered especially heinous by medieval standards, warranted punishments beyond ordinary execution methods. Killing family members or using poison provoked particular revulsion, requiring exceptional responses. Acts of rebellion during peasant uprisings or urban revolts led to exemplary punishments meant to discourage others. Leaders of failed rebellions faced the most severe penalties as warnings against challenging established power. Crimes against nature as defined by medieval law included various acts that communities considered abominable. These transgressions violated both human law and divine commandments in the medieval worldview. Theft from churches or sacred spaces represented particularly serious offenses in deeply religious medieval society. Stealing consecrated objects meant robbing God himself according to prevailing theological understanding. Repeated offenses after previous punishments sometimes escalated to extreme measures, including boiling in oil. Authorities viewed habitual criminals as incorrigible threats requiring permanent removal from society. Prisoners who escaped from dungeons and were recaptured might face enhanced punishments for their audacity. Breaking confinement demonstrated dangerous disrespect for authority that demanded harsh correction. The crimes punished this way varied across regions and periods, reflecting local customs and priorities. Yet all shared the common element of threatening fundamental social, political, or religious order. Fourth, the execution ritual. Dawn broke over medieval towns on execution days as crowds began gathering near the designated punishment site. Common folk left their timber-framed houses, while nobles observed from windows in stone manor houses. Town criers walked cobbled streets announcing the coming execution, while ringing bells summoned citizens to witness justice. Their voices echoed between buildings as residents prepared for the grim spectacle ahead. The condemned prisoner spent final hours in dungeon cells where stone walls wept with moisture and torchlight flickered. Priests offered opportunities for confession and final prayers, while guards maintained constant watch. A procession formed as the prisoner was led from dungeon through town streets toward the execution ground. Guards in leather and chainmail surrounded the condemned, while crowd members shouted or prayed. The executioner appeared wearing distinctive clothing that marked his profession and separated him from ordinary citizens. His face often remained covered to maintain anonymity and protect against future retribution. Upon reaching the execution site, the prisoner confronted the terrible apparatus that awaited their final moments. The cauldron bubbled violently as flames roared beneath and black smoke rose into gray skies. Officials read formal charges aloud, declaring the crimes committed and the sentence lawfully imposed by proper authority. Their voices carried across the assembled crowd, ensuring all understood the reasons for this punishment. The condemned sometimes received permission to speak final words to the gathered witnesses and officials. These last statements varied from defiant challenges to tearful pleas for mercy or forgiveness. Guards bound the prisoner using ropes and chains that prevented resistance during the terrible moments ahead. The executioner positioned himself with tools ready to complete his grim professional duty. The actual execution proceeded quickly once all preparations reached completion and official signals were given. Witnesses later described scenes of horror that haunted their memories for remaining years of life. Afterwards, authorities often displayed remains as continued warnings to potential criminals in the population. The execution ritual served purposes beyond individual punishment, extending into social control and intimidation. Fifth, legacy of fear and control. Medieval rulers understood that spectacular punishments created fear that maintained order more effectively than standing armies. The memory of executions lingered in collective consciousness long after bodies disappeared from public view. Chronicles and manuscripts preserved accounts of notable executions that scribes recorded in monastery scriptoriums. These written records ensured that knowledge of punishments traveled across time and geography. Artists occasionally depicted execution scenes in manuscript illuminations and church carvings as moral warnings to viewers. Visual representations complemented written accounts in communicating the consequences of transgression. The practice of extreme public punishment gradually declined as societies evolved toward different understandings of justice. Enlightenment philosophers questioned whether such spectacles served genuine purposes or merely satisfied base instincts. Yet the psychological impact of these historical practices continued shaping cultural attitudes toward crime and punishment. Stories passed through generations carried lessons about authority, obedience, and the price of rebellion. Medieval torture and execution methods revealed fundamental aspects of human societies under stress and conflict. The willingness to inflict terrible suffering reflected complex intersections of power, religion, and social control. Modern scholars study these historical practices to understand medieval mentalities and the gradual development toward humanitarian values. The contrast between past and present illuminates how far legal systems have progressed. The legacy of medieval punishment reminds us that civilization remains fragile and requires constant vigilance to maintain. Rights and protections we consider fundamental resulted from centuries of struggle against arbitrary cruelty. Archaeological discoveries occasionally unearth execution sites or implements that provide physical evidence of historical accounts. These artifacts connect us tangibly with ancestors who lived in dramatically different moral universes. The story of torture by boiling oil stands as testament to human capacity for both cruelty and eventual moral progress. Understanding this dark history helps us appreciate contemporary standards while remaining alert to potential regression. Medieval justice systems operated under assumptions radically different from modern principles about human dignity and rights. Yet examining these differences teaches valuable lessons about the evolution of civilized society. The medieval practice of execution by boiling oil represents one of history's darkest chapters in human justice systems. Through understanding these terrible methods, we gain perspective on the progress civilization has achieved while remembering that such progress remains vulnerable without vigilance. Dark Medieval invites you to continue this journey through history's shadows by liking this video, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing to our channel. Join us as we illuminate the past to better understand our present. Until our next dark tale, remember that history's harshest lessons teach us our most valuable truths.